Economists, yet another day in paradise. Today we are going to be looking at aggregate supply. I'm going to make this a shorter video because I'm just going to be going through the short run aggregate supply. In macroeconomics, the supply side of the economy is really important because pretty much we have to study the overall capacity of the economy by knowing the amount we can supply. By definition, aggregate supply is the total amount of goods and services in all the industries in the economy that they'll produce at any given price level. So it's very similar to aggregate demand, where once again it's a sum of all the industry business activity. You can pretty much just look at it as the sum of all the supply curves of all the different industries in an economy. But the biggest difference between supply and demand is that we do separate short run versus long run. This video is going to be a bit shorter. I'm trying to shorten them a little. This one is going to be all about short run aggregate supply. On the graph, it looks short run aggregate supply very similar to your regular supply curve. So you have the upward slope, and we'll talk about that. So that means that there's a positive relationship between the level of output as well as the price level. The higher the prices are, the more output is being produced. Now, the main assumption in the short run is that none of the factors of production, particularly wages, change. Obviously, over the long term, there will be changes in factors of production as you produce more and more. But that's the assumption of the short run model, that especially wage, all factors of production are fixed together. Now, when you do produce a larger level of output, firms are going to start facing higher average costs of production. They're going to increase. So, for example, your staff, you'd have to start paying them overtime if they're staying later to produce more and more items. So your costs are going to rise over time. This is very similar to higher level students. You're going to remember the law of diminishing returns. So this pretty much, it just means that the marginal and average costs are going to rise as output increases in the short run. So because there's more and more average costs associated with producing, that's why you see this upward facing curve. So when you go from producing Y1 to Y2, all of your costs, you're paying more overtime, you have more direct costs involved, things like raw materials. So obviously the price also is going to be reflected in that. And the law of supply and demand then kicks in. We have movement along the curve. Similar to microeconomics, we also have shifts in supply curves. Now, the shifts are caused by anything but a change in price. Remember, price always dictates movement along a curve. Anything other than price that is impacting the economy will create a shift. So let's take a look at some of the main things that create this shift. Now, these shifts are called supply-side shocks. All right. That's what we refer to a shift to the left or the right in the short-term, short-run model of aggregate supply. So supply-side shock, it's kind of hard to say, isn't it? Pretty much, it's any factors that cause changes in the cost of production. So let's take a look at a few typical ones. A change in wage rates will cause a shift. An increase in wages results in an increase in costs of the firm's productions. Therefore, there's a fall in the aggregate supply. For example, if the government raised the legal minimum wage, that would increase the labor costs. Labor unions, whose priority really is just to kind of protect the wages and improve the conditions of workers, are going to negotiate higher wages, and that's going to result in a fall of short-run aggregate supply because it's now more expensive to produce the same amount. So the shift, whenever there's a shift that hurts the supply, it's going to end up in a shift to the left. Because once again, your overall quantity is going to decrease at the same price level. Anything that improves the costs of supply, which means the costs become lower, it's going to create a shift in the right. So in the example I just gave, where minimum wage is increased, you're going to go from SRAS 1 to SRAS 3 as a result of an increase in cost for suppliers. So always ask yourself, is it increasing or decreasing the cost of production? And then that'll help you know whether to shift it to the right or to the left. And this should not be anything surprising or new, because a lot of this is similar to macro. Another item that could cause a shift would be a change in the cost of the raw materials. We use those raw materials to create any products and output. So once again, if you have a product that includes rubber, and now there's all of a sudden an increase in cost for whatever reason in rubber, changes in the price of oil, if oil is part of your industry, can really impact the cost of your overall production. So that would cause a shift, a change in the cost of raw material. Similar to that, you have a change in the price of imports, because a lot of times if you don't have your raw materials locally, you're importing them from other countries. So if the price decreases, it would shift it then to the right. If a price of an import is increasing for whatever reason economically, it could even also be due to exchange rates. Remember, it doesn't just have to be the suppliers making the prices go up for imports. If your currency is now weaker against an external currency, that will cause a shift, because although nobody raised prices, you're still paying more dirhams if you're located in UAE for that product in Europe, which is in euros, because of the difference in currency exchange rates. So remember, change of price of imports can also shift your aggregate supply curve in the short run. Direct taxes and subsidies is yet another one. An increase in indirect taxes is going to cause increase in costs of production. Remember, indirect taxes will then impact any purchases you make as a business, so your costs are going to steadily go up. So that would obviously cause a shift in your short run aggregate supply curve. If your subsidies are reduced, once again, the costs are going up. So that causes a shift to the left. So remember, if costs go up, shift to the left. If costs go right, if costs go down, that's a shift to the right. I'm struggling here, guys, I'm sorry. So when you combine aggregate supply and aggregate demand in the short run in the economy, you get a beautiful little supply demand curve. Once again, very, very similar to microeconomics. So you put the average price level, the equilibrium. This is pretty much the ultimate point of production in an entire economy. Is going to be set at PL. So that's the average price level. Once again, be very wary of the difference in labeling. So although it's a similar shape of curve, make sure that you label it properly when you're doing a macroeconomics one. This wouldn't just be price and quantity. You've got average price levels, PL, real output, because once again, it's adjusted for inflation. So there's no incentives for producers to increase their output or raise their prices when we're at this nice, beautiful equilibrium level. All right. We're going to discuss equilibrium a little bit more later on, but that's all you need for now. Just make sure, once again, this point here, be sure to label the axis accurately, showing that the short run aggregate supply curve increases. All right. So just make sure that we're doing good there. The next video is going to be about the long run aggregate supply. Take care, guys.